We bought our first house in spring of 2023, a small 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood outside Seattle. The house was built in the 70s and needed work, but the price was right, and we were excited to make it our own. The previous owner was an elderly woman who'd lived there for 40 years. She passed away, and her children sold the property as is. The realtor mentioned she'd been a bit of a hoarder in her later years, but they'd cleaned everything out before listing. We started renovations in June. The plan was to update the kitchen and bathroom, repaint everything, and refinish the hardwood floors. My husband, James, handled most of the work himself since he'd done construction in college. The kitchen was first. We ripped out the old cabinets and discovered the drywall behind them was water damaged. James said we'd need to replace that entire section of wall. He cut away the damaged drywall with a utility knife and pulled it down in large chunks. That's when we saw the gap. Behind the drywall, between the studs, there was a space about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, and it wasn't empty. There were dozens of notebooks. Spiral-bound, different colors, stacked neatly in the wall cavity. They looked old, the covers faded and dusty. James pulled one out and opened it. The pages were filled with handwriting. Neat, small handwriting that covered every line. He flipped through several pages and looked at me with a confused expression. He said it looked like someone's diary. We pulled out all the notebooks and counted them. 23 total, each one completely filled with writing. We sat on the floor of our half-demolished kitchen and started reading. The notebooks were dated, spanning from 1985 to 2019. They were written by the previous owner, Margaret. The early entries were mundane, daily observations about weather, grocery lists, thoughts about her garden, normal diary stuff. But around 1990, the tone changed. Margaret wrote about hearing sounds at night, footsteps in the hallway when she was alone, doors opening that she'd closed. She blamed it on the house settling or her imagination. Then she started writing about finding things moved, small items. A coffee cup she'd left on the counter would be in the sink. A book she'd been reading would be in a different room. She wrote that she thought she was developing dementia, but then she started finding evidence that someone else was in the house. A wet towel in the bathroom when she hadn't showered, food missing from the fridge. Her bedroom door locked from the inside when she came home. She called the police multiple times. They'd search the house and find nothing. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone hiding. They suggested she install better locks and maybe see a doctor about memory issues. Margaret became paranoid. The entries grew more frantic. She wrote about staying up all night, watching her hallway, about installing cameras that never caught anything, about changing her locks over and over. Then, in a 1995 entry, she wrote something that made my hands shake. She'd found a small opening behind her bedroom closet, a hole in the drywall, hidden behind clothes. She'd noticed it because clothes kept falling off hangers, and when she investigated, she found the hole. She wrote that the hole led to a crawl space between the walls. She couldn't see how deep it went. She covered it with a board and screwed it shut. The entries after that were calmer. The strange occurrences stopped. Margaret wrote that she finally felt safe in her house again. She never mentioned the hole again. James and I sat there processing what we'd read. Then we looked at each other with the same thought. We went upstairs to the master bedroom and opened the closet. We pushed aside the clothes that the previous owners had left behind, old dresses and coats they hadn't bothered taking. At the back of the closet, low near the floor, we found a board screwed into the drywall. James got his drill and removed the screws. The board came away, revealing a hole about 2 feet wide. We shined a flashlight inside. It was a crawl space, just like Margaret had written. The space ran along the exterior wall of the house, between the drywall and the outer structure. We could see it extended in both directions, following the wall. The beam of the flashlight caught something. A blanket wadded up in the corner of the crawl space. Next to it were empty food containers and water bottles. Garbage that had been hidden there. Someone had been living in our walls, or at least spending time there. And based on the dust and cobwebs, it had been years ago, probably back when Margaret was still alive and experiencing those strange events. We called the police. They came and searched the crawl space thoroughly. They found more evidence of someone having been there, more trash, some old clothes, a sleeping bag. They found access points in other parts of the house where someone could have entered and exited the walls. The detective told us it wasn't uncommon. People hiding in houses, living in walls or attics or crawl spaces. Usually homeless individuals looking for shelter, sometimes stalkers, occasionally squatters. They'd likely been caught or scared off when Margaret discovered and sealed the main entrance in 1995. But reading those journals, knowing what Margaret went through, was haunting. She'd spent years thinking she was losing her mind. The police hadn't believed her. Her own family probably thought she was paranoid or developing dementia, and she was right the whole time. Someone had been in her house, watching her, moving her things, making her feel unsafe in her own home, and she lived with that terror for years, before finally finding proof. We sealed up every possible access point to the crawl spaces. We had an inspector come and map out every gap in the house's structure. We installed security cameras and motion sensors. But I still think about Margaret, sometimes, about how she hid those journals in the wall, like she was leaving evidence behind, like she wanted someone to know the truth eventually. And we found them 30 years later, long after she was gone. She'd discovered what was happening in her house, but only after years of gaslighting herself and being dismissed by everyone around her. By the time she had proof, the damage was done. She'd spent years doubting her own sanity. That's what haunts me most. Not that someone was in the walls, but that Margaret knew something was wrong, and nobody believed her until it was too late. And even after she sealed the access point and the incident stopped, she still lived in that house for another 24 years. She never told anyone about the journals or what she'd found. She just lived with it silently until she died. We found the truth in those walls, but for Margaret, discovering it came too late to give her back those years of fear and doubt. I moved into a duplex in Austin in early 2022. It was a newer build, maybe 10 years old, split down the middle into two identical units. I had the left side, and a guy named Derek lived on the right. Derek was quiet. I'd see him occasionally coming and going, but we never really talked beyond basic neighborly greetings. He worked from home doing something with computers, kept to himself. Perfect neighbor as far as I was concerned. The duplex had good soundproofing. I could barely hear anything from his side, which was nice. I'd lived in apartments with paper-thin walls before, and this was a huge upgrade. I could play music, have friends over, live normally without worrying about noise complaints. About 6 months after I moved in, my girlfriend Maya started staying over more frequently. One night, we were in the living room watching TV when she asked me if I'd ever been inside Derek's side of the duplex. I said no, why would I? She pointed at the shared wall between our units and said something seemed off about it. I asked what she meant. She walked over and knocked on the wall. It sounded solid, dense. She knocked on the opposite wall in my living room for comparison. That one sounded hollow and normal, like standard drywall over studs. Maya said the shared wall sounded weird, too thick. She worked in commercial real estate and had been around enough construction to notice details like that. She said it felt like there was extra material between our units. I told her the place was built with good soundproofing. That's probably why. She nodded but still seemed unconvinced. She said something about the wall feeling too thick even for soundproofing, but she let it go. I didn't think much about it until a few weeks later. I was doing some basic maintenance, replacing an outlet cover in my living room near the shared wall. When I removed the cover plate, I noticed something strange. The electrical box was recessed deeper than normal, like there was extra space behind the drywall. I got a flashlight and looked into the gap around the electrical box. I could see insulation, but behind that, there seemed to be another layer of drywall, like the wall had been built twice, with a gap between. That night I mentioned it to Maya. She got that look on her face like she'd been right about something. She said we should check if there was a reason for double walls. We went down to the building management office the next day and asked if we could see the building plans. The property manager seemed confused by the request, but eventually pulled up digital files. Maya studied the floor plans on the manager's computer screen. She pointed at the shared wall between my unit and Derek's. According to the plans, it was a standard wall, single layer of drywall on each side with insulation and studs between. Nothing unusual, but Maya measured the dimensions on the plan and compared them to what she remembered of my apartment layout. She said the shared wall in reality was at least 8 inches thicker than what the plans showed. The property manager said maybe the plans weren't updated after construction, that contractors sometimes make changes. Maya asked if they had inspection records or photos from the build. The manager said she'd have to check and get back to us. We left feeling unsettled. Back at my place, Maya went to the shared wall again and knocked on it at different points. She said the thickness wasn't consistent. Some areas sounded more hollow than others. She asked if I'd ever noticed Derek doing construction work on his side. I said no, but I wouldn't necessarily hear it through the soundproofing. She suggested we ask him directly about the wall. I felt weird about confronting my neighbor about his wall structure, but Maya was persistent. That evening I knocked on Derek's door. He answered, looking slightly annoyed at being interrupted. I asked him casually if he'd done any renovation work on his unit. He said no, everything was original from when he moved in 3 years ago. I mentioned that I'd noticed the shared wall seemed thicker than standard and wondered if he knew why. His expression changed. Just for a second, something flickered across his face. Then he said he'd never noticed anything unusual about the walls and closed the door pretty quickly. Maya had been standing just out of sight listening. She said Derek's reaction was suspicious. I told her we were probably overthinking it, but she insisted something was wrong. The next day, the property manager called. She said she'd found the inspection records from the original build. According to those records, the shared wall between units had been built to standard specifications. No modifications noted. But she also mentioned something interesting. About a year after Derek moved in, he'd requested permission to do some soundproofing work. The management company had approved it as long as he used licensed contractors and didn't modify any structural elements. Maya asked me if I remembered when Derek did that work. I didn't. I hadn't lived there yet. But now it made sense. Derek had added soundproofing to his side of the shared wall, which is why it was thicker than the original plans showed. Except Maya wasn't satisfied with that explanation. She said soundproofing material isn't that thick. 8 inches of additional wall space was excessive. She wanted to know what was actually in that gap. I told her we couldn't just go tearing into a shared wall, but she had another idea. She knew someone who did HVAC work and had access to inspection cameras, the kind that could snake through small openings. Her friend came by 2 days later with his equipment. We didn't tell him exactly why we wanted to look inside the wall, just said we were concerned about potential pest issues. He drilled a small hole near the baseboard on my side of the shared wall. The hole was tiny, barely noticeable. He fed the camera through and we watched the screen. The camera showed insulation first, then a gap of about 4 inches, then another layer of drywall. That was Derek's original wall. But between my wall and his wall, in that 4-inch gap, there was something else. Wires. Lots of wires running vertically through the space. Small black cables bundled together, and what looked like small rectangular devices attached to the cables at regular intervals. Maya's friend said those weren't electrical wires. He said they looked like data cables, network cables, and the small devices looked like microphones or sensors of some kind. My stomach dropped. We had him move the camera to different positions along the wall. The cables and devices ran the entire length of the shared wall from floor to ceiling. Derek had built a false wall on his side and filled the gap with surveillance equipment. He was recording everything that happened in my apartment through the shared wall. We called the police immediately. They took our statement and the video footage from the inspection camera. They got a warrant and searched Derek's unit that same day. They found server equipment in his apartment, hard drives full of audio recordings from my side of the duplex. Months worth of recordings. Everything I'd said, every conversation, every private moment, all documented and stored. Derek was arrested. The detective told us later that he'd done this in previous places he'd lived. He'd seek out duplexes or adjoining apartments, set up surveillance equipment in the shared walls, and record his neighbors. They found evidence of him selling some recordings online to voyeurism websites. I moved out immediately. I couldn't stay in that apartment knowing everything had been recorded. Knowing that every conversation with Maya, every phone call, every private moment had been captured by someone on the other side of the wall. The worst part was how long it had been going on. Derek had set up his surveillance system before I even moved in. From day one, he'd been listening, and I'd had no idea. Maya had noticed something wrong with the wall within months of staying over regularly, but I'd dismissed it. If I'd taken her concerns seriously sooner, if we'd investigated when she first brought it up, we could have discovered what was happening earlier. Instead, we found the truth after nearly a year of being recorded, after countless private conversations and intimate moments had been captured and stored. We discovered what was in the wall, but only after the damage was done. My parents bought their retirement home in 2018. Small ranch house in rural Oregon, lots of land, peaceful area. They'd always wanted to live in the country after my dad retired from teaching. I helped them move in that summer. The house was old, built in the 50s, but solid. The previous owners had maintained it well. Wood floors, original fixtures, a big front porch. Everything seemed fine. My parents were excited to start this new chapter. 2 years later, in 2020, my mom called me upset. She said they'd been doing some maintenance work, replacing old insulation in the attic, when they found something disturbing. Behind the insulation, stuffed between the rafters, were dozens of letters. Old letters, yellowed with age, still in their original envelopes, all addressed to the same person, a woman named Helen Pritchard at that address. The letters had never been opened. They were dated from 1968 to 1973, all from the same sender, someone named Robert Pritchard. My mom said the return address was a military base in Vietnam. She described finding them in detail. My dad had been pulling out the old pink fiberglass insulation when he noticed something solid behind it. At first, he thought it was just old newspaper, used as extra insulation, which was common in houses from that era. But when he pulled the material out, he realized they were envelopes bound together with rotted rubber bands. The rubber bands disintegrated when he touched them. The letters scattered across the attic floor. My mom said there were at least 40 or 50 of them, maybe more. They'd spent an hour carefully collecting them all and organizing them by postmark date. She asked if they should open the letters. I told her they should probably try to find Helen first, return them if she was still alive. My mum agreed. She said it felt wrong to read someone else's mail, especially letters that seemed so personal. They searched online but couldn't find any current information on Helen Pritchard. My dad went to the county records office and discovered that Helen had owned the house from 1965 until her death in 2003. She'd lived there alone for 38 years. The clerk at the records office mentioned that Helen had been somewhat of a recluse. Nobody in town knew much about her. She kept to herself, rarely went into town except for necessities. The clerk remembered her as a sad woman who always seemed to be carrying some invisible weight. The house had changed hands twice after her death before my parents bought it. Apparently nobody had cleaned out the attic properly. The letters had been hidden there for over 50 years, forgotten behind layers of insulation. My mom said she spent several days thinking about those unopened letters. She'd see them sitting in a box in their spare room and wonder what they contained. Why would someone hide letters from their husband? Why never open them? Finally, she couldn't stand not knowing anymore. She opened one letter carefully, trying not to damage the aged paper. She said she felt guilty doing it but wanted to understand why they'd been hidden. The letter was from Robert, addressed to his wife Helen. He wrote about his experiences in Vietnam, though he was careful not to share details that might worry her. He wrote about the heat, about missing American food, about the friends he'd made in his unit. But mostly he wrote about how much he missed her, how he thought about her every day, how he couldn't wait to come home and start the family they'd planned. The letter was dated March 1968. Robert's handwriting was neat and careful. He signed it, "All my love, forever and always, Robert." My mum opened several more letters, all similar in tone. Love letters from a husband to his wife, written during wartime. Letters full of hope and plans for the future. Robert wrote about the house they'd bought before he deployed, about the garden he wanted to plant, about the children they'd talked about having. In a letter from July 1969, Robert wrote that his tour would be extended another 6 months. He apologized for not being able to come home when promised. He told Helen to be strong, that it would be over soon, that they'd have the rest of their lives together. The letters continued through 1970, 1971, 1972. Robert's tone remained optimistic, even as the war dragged on. He wrote less about the war and more about his dreams for their future. Detailed plans for renovating the house, names he liked for potential children, places he wanted to take Helen on a proper honeymoon once he got home. The last letter was dated January 8, 1973. Robert wrote that there were rumors his unit would be coming home within months. The war was winding down. He was excited, making concrete plans. He'd already been thinking about what job he'd look for once he was back. He told Helen he loved her and he'd see her soon. My dad did more research after my mom read him some of the letters. He found Robert's military records through a veterans database. Robert Pritchard had been killed in action in Vietnam on January 21, 1973. 13 days after writing that final letter, Helen would have received notification of his death from the military. But these letters, they kept arriving for weeks afterward. Letters written by a man who was already dead by the time they reached her mailbox. Letters full of hope and future plans from someone who no longer had a future. My mom was crying when she told me this part. She said she couldn't imagine the pain Helen must have felt, receiving letters from her dead husband, opening the mailbox day after day and finding another envelope in Robert's handwriting, reading his words about coming home, about their future together, all while knowing he was already gone. And at some point, Helen stopped opening them. She must have recognized the handwriting, known they were Robert's final letters, and made the choice to hide them instead, to preserve them unopened rather than face the words inside. My dad found Helen's obituary from 2003. It was brief. Helen Pritchard, age 78, died peacefully at home. No surviving family. Private burial. No service. The obituary mentioned she was preceded in death by her husband Robert, who died in Vietnam in 1973. Helen never remarried. She lived in that house alone for 30 years after Robert's death, and during all that time, his unopened letters sat hidden in the attic above her head. My parents weren't sure what to do with the letters. They felt a responsibility to make sure Robert's words weren't just thrown away or lost again. My dad spent weeks tracking down Robert's family. He finally found a distant cousin in Washington state who agreed to take them. The cousin, a woman in her 60s named Patricia, drove down to Oregon to collect the letters. She told my parents that the family had always wondered what happened to Robert's letters. They knew he'd written regularly because he'd mentioned it in earlier letters that Helen had shared with his parents before his death. But after the notification of his death, Helen had cut off contact with Robert's family completely. She'd never responded to their calls or letters. They'd assumed she was drowning in grief and needed space. Eventually, they stopped trying to reach her. They never knew what happened to Robert's final letters. They'd assumed they were lost in the chaos of the war's end. Patricia sat at my parents' kitchen table and read through some of the letters. She cried openly. She said Robert had been her favorite cousin growing up. She'd been only 12 when he died, but she remembered him as kind and funny. Seeing his words, his personality coming through in the letters, was like having a piece of him back. She asked my parents if they knew why Helen had hidden the letters unopened. My dad explained what they'd pieced together about the timing, how the letters would have arrived after Helen learned of Robert's death, how unbearable that must have been. Patricia nodded sadly. She said she understood, but it broke her heart. Robert had poured so much love into those letters. He'd written them during the darkest period of his life, finding hope by thinking about his wife and their future. And Helen never read them, never knew what his final thoughts and feelings were. Before Patricia left, she told my parents something else. She said that after Robert died, his mother had tried repeatedly to reach Helen. She'd wanted to share memories of Robert, to grieve together, to make sure Helen knew how much Robert had loved her. But Helen refused all contact. Robert's mother died in 1985, still wondering why Helen had shut them out. The family always assumed Helen blamed them somehow, or couldn't bear any reminders of Robert. Now Patricia understood it was probably just too painful. Helen couldn't face anything connected to Robert, including his family and his final letters. After Patricia left with the letters, my mom said the house felt different. She'd lie in bed at night thinking about Helen living there alone for 3 decades. Thinking about those letters in the attic, preserved but unread, a time capsule of love that Helen couldn't bring herself to open. My dad mentioned once that he wondered if Helen had intended for someone to find them eventually. She could have destroyed the letters if she wanted them gone completely. Instead, she'd hidden them carefully in the attic, wrapped and preserved, like she wanted them to exist but couldn't bear to open them herself. Maybe she hoped that someday, long after she was gone, someone would find them and make sure Robert's words reached someone who could appreciate them. Maybe that was her way of honoring his memory while protecting herself from the pain. The truth had been in my parents' attic the whole time. Helen had hidden Robert's final expressions of love there deliberately, unable to face opening letters from a dead man. And for 50 years, Robert's final words sat unread in the darkness, waiting for someone to discover them. My mom said it haunted her for months afterward. She'd think about Helen walking through that house, looking up at the ceiling, knowing those letters were right above her, living with that choice every single day for 30 years. We found the truth about what happened to those letters, but for Helen, the truth of what they contained died with her. She discovered the worst truth of her life when she learned Robert was dead, and she never let herself discover what his final letters said. She never learned about his hopes, his plans, his love expressed in those final weeks of his life. By the time someone finally opened them and read Robert's words, both he and Helen were long gone. The future they dreamed about together never happened, and Helen spent 3 decades alone in a house filled with the ghost of that lost future, with unopened letters in the attic that could have given her some small comfort or closure. But she'd made her choice, and by the time we discovered what was hidden in those walls, it was far too late for any of it to matter to the people it was meant for.